are monitoring the White House press briefing that is now underway with Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. But in recent days, KJP has been sharing the podium with White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby. And according to a new report, some Biden officials feel like his presence could be perceived as an insult to his colleague because of her race and gender. The New York Times writes, quote, "The White House attributes Mr. Kirby's larger role to the flurry of international news and says that he will brief less often once the Middle East crisis ebbs. But the perception in Washington," they write, "is that President Biden has allowed Mr. Kirby, who is white, to upstage a black woman as the face of his White House, and it has turned their double act into a third-rail subject." Kayleigh, I have to admit, the insult I see and the insult I find is that assertion by the New York Times that reduces everything to gender and race, that has no place in Kirby's experience and prowess and the reason that he is there at the podium. And I venture to say KJP might feel the same way.
Of course, the New York Times is always going to look at things through that lens. Let me put that aside and just speak as someone who did stand at that same podium. This is an absolutely brutal piece. The piece says that she's yielded the spotlight to a lower-ranking official. Well, he's no longer lower-ranking. Over the weekend, he was appointed assistant to the president, so he's now her equal. It says she has a co-host at the briefings who evinces a clarity and comfort that can sometimes elude Miss Karine Jean-Pierre. It's so unusual to have a co-host at the podium. Ian Sams, who speaks for White House counsel, we didn't have such a role when I was there. There was not an Ian Sams who stood by me and took questions for 40 minutes. We did have a spokesperson for the National Security Council. That person never once took to the podium. That's what the White House press secretary does. But the 2 points that really stood out to me, and this was 3 people with knowledge of the West Wing, said several senior aides went to President Biden and said, she's not seasoned enough. And I've got a feel for her. I can't imagine walking into the West Wing today wondering which of my colleagues around me went to the president and said she's not able to do this job. That's really tough. But what I think is even tougher, if this is true, Biden apparently said this to her. And it's a quote, according to 2 people with direct knowledge. "Don't worry about being nervous." I'm paraphrasing that quote. "You'll have an admiral looking over your shoulder." They said it was meant in an affable way. The White House denies it was said. But when I went to the White House, there had not been a press briefing for 400 days. And I had a boss who looked at me, President Trump, and said, "Go to a briefing." Had confidence in me to do a briefing. And he didn't say, "Go to a briefing. Don't worry. You're going to have an admiral over your shoulder." He said, "Go to a briefing," because he trusted me. And it's sad, if true, that President Biden didn't give her that same start.
Anis, what do you think about this?
I mean, it makes American people wonder who's in charge. You have 2 top White House officials and literally showing their miscommunication on a public stage. So,
yeah, that's right. Like more questions about who's in charge, who's making the decisions. And I think, Dagan, to that point, and more, when we have our questions, it has nothing to do with race or gender. Let's make Kayleigh's point here, take Kayleigh's point. If she's failing at her job, we can see the failure. We can see the lack of experience and the lack of ability to answer questions in any way, shape, or form. And the whole point is, if commitment to transparency is the point here, if information to the American people, then fine, let it be disseminated by the expert and the person who we trust, and maybe that is the admiral.
She has the opportunity and the job where her performance can speak for itself, as John Kirby's performance can speak for itself. And upstaging him should be easy. Last April, don't forget, when he was talking about the Afghanistan withdrawal, he said, all of this talk of chaos, I didn't see it. What? So a lot to be proud of there, said John Kirby. But this New York Times article, this is just the Beltway bathwater.
Yeah, they're virtue signaling, and they're trying to make excuses for Karine Jean-Pierre, who's hoping to use her gender and race as a shield from criticism, which I think is unacceptable, and that speaks to the soft bigotry of low expectations. We should expect more from our press secretaries. Kayleigh, you know that better than anybody else. You and Dana Perino are 2 of the most impressive people at Fox News, because you have to have encyclopedic knowledge of everything that's happening in politics and also know the personalities of everyone in the room and be able to anticipate any possible question. It is a big ask because it's a big job. Unfortunately, she's not good at it. And we have seen her failing. We have seen her sinking during her tenure. And frankly, it's cruel to put someone in that position. And, you know, we saw Admiral Kirby give briefings over at Foggy Bottom. And you had to ask yourself, you know, given the contrast, why isn't he in that role? And it's because of the fear of politically correct virtue signaling pushback from places like the New York Times.